It's the Misfits.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Ministry Misfits. We have no idea what episode this is.
It should be season 4, or not season 4. I skipped a lot of seasons. Season 2, episode 4.
I don't know if I can trust you anymore.
Yeah,
you're way ahead now.
Math is not our thing, as you already know.
Yeah, you were supposed to be the math guy.
That's true.
So
I just butchered it right there.
Yeah, we're in real trouble now, so please send help. Today, though, we don't have a guest because our guest forgot to answer his phone when we kept calling. So we're going to do this, and this is a topic that you actually suggested.
Yeah.
I then went and made the outline and filled out without telling you. And this all involves you, but you have no idea what we're going to say, and so I'm going to have a lot of fun today.
Yeah, I think this is going to be Misfits Christmas Part 2,
yes.
Except for we don't have fun Christmas sweaters
in
on.
April.
Yeah.
Well, when this is releasing, I think it'll be May. So yeah. Christmas in May.
Yeah, it doesn't have a good ring to it.
Well, we'll see. So we are talking about two different words. Vocation and calling.
Mm-hmm.
And calling is something that we've talked about a lot on here, and we actually hear a lot of people's calling stories, those of you that don't fast forward through the opening credits.
Yep.
So we are actually going to talk, though, what these things actually are. And so we're going to start out and define our terms. Now, Brandon does have some notes in front of him, so he is able to help us a little bit here. So, vocation is the first word we are actually going to look at.
Mm-hmm.
It comes from the Latin word, and this is actually important. We are actually looking at where these words come from, and we'll see why in a minute. Vocation comes from the Latin word vocare, which means to call.
So we almost get both words in the definition of
almost
vocation.
And then Webster's goes on to say that it's a strong feeling of suitability for a particular career or occupation, which those are normally the words we associate with a vocation, as a career or occupation.
Yep.
And then the second one is a person's employment or occupation. Normally, though, it's one that they regard with worth and great dedication. Mm-hmm. So this is a job that they want to do.
Yeah, and feel valued while doing it.
Right, which we could have a whole conversation about how those don't normally exist anymore.
Yes, in a roundabout way. So that's why I think I partially wanted to bring up this topic a little bit, because that's where I think calling comes in.
Right, so calling is actually a Viking word. It comes from the Norse word kalla, which means to summon loudly. So Webster's goes on, it's a strong urge toward a particular way of life or career or a vocation. So we've now defined both words in the other word. But the important thing, it's a strong urge towards a particular way of life, not just the career.
Yeah, not that specific job, a more broader term.
Until we get to the second definition, which is literally a profession or occupation.
Yeah, I want to say I disagree with that, but it's Webster's definition, so well, who am I?
Right, and this is where we've got to separate out the fact that words sometimes will have different meanings when we are talking about a worldly definition and the definition for a believer.
Mm-hmm.
And this is part of what it means to be in the world, not of the world. The idea of transforming and renewing as opposed to just going through life. Is that sometimes we hear words being used by the public and we are like, they're completely misusing it or twisting it or doing something wrong with it. When in reality, they're actually using the word correctly. But within our Christian circles, we use these words in a different way.
Yeah. I think probably if we wanted to have added a third word in here, we could have said our purpose.
Which we're getting to.
Okay.
We're getting to our purpose. Because...
But I think that's the more the worldly word that we hear sometimes versus vocation or calling.
Well, I would say we normally... Well, and this is where, again, culture comes in. Somebody I saw actually was talking the other day about... they're from They are like from everywhere. They consider themselves from the world, but not in a like new agey like hippie sense.
Mm-hmm.
They were like born in France, lived in London, lived in Greece, lived in Italy, were spent a summer in Rome, spent a summer in Australia, spent some time in Beijing on study, and now they're in New York working for some publication. They've literally been just about everywhere.
Yes.
They talk about the fact that one thing that is so weird about the U.S. is that there is a very distinct focus as a culture on jobs. Career-oriented life is what a lot of people would say is what you have within the United States. Is it's all career-oriented. It's all about the job. It's all about the money. And so because of that, typically, when you look at happiness factors from a psychology standpoint, there's actually more of a likelihood that people with high happiness standards are coming out of Europe, Asia, Africa, not coming from the U.S. especially.
It could be because they get more than 2 weeks of paid vacation, too.
Paid vacation, there's things
there's
like...
some other things.
Right. Healthcare, things like that, the stress of not having to worry about where the money's coming from when, little Timmy is sick, all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But they also pointed out that part of the other thing within the U.S. is that people don't have to worry as much for other types of things. So most people have a vehicle. Most people have vehicle insurance. Most people, even with gas prices this high, can at least get to work. Those sort of things happen in the U.S. because we are career-oriented and there's more money involved. There's more money to spend on things even when things are more expensive. So there's a trade-off.
Yeah.
But all of that is dealing with these words in a worldly term. Look at the Bible, and we're going to walk through a couple of these different things. We're just going to, for time's sake, we're going to share the story. We're going to see, again, so we are going to turn this almost into a Merry Misfitting.
Yeah, and see how many points I get.
Let's see how much of this you know about the vocation or calling for these people within Scripture. So Noah. What is the call vocation type of idea here?
When we say for him, it was to build the ark.
Right. He's called out by God to build the ark.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know what his normal career was, anything like that, but he was called out to build the ark. Abram.
I'm just thinking of a couple here because I'm like...
Right, there are a couple, but the big one is he's supposed to pack up his stuff, pack up his family. He has no idea who it is that's telling him to do this, but to go off to this land that is set out before him, right? That's the call. Thank
you for putting that into words. So
right.
I'm like,
that's
I know there's
call.
A couple different journeys in the past that one, he messed up. So
right.
I'm like, I know there was a couple different journeys in there.
And then, there's also Jacob. Jacob is, what's his call?
Oof, this is going to stump me on this one. I can't, all I can think of is my friend Jacob, so that's not helping me right now.
Jacob is called to basically the same thing that Abram is. Isaac, we don't hear much about his calling. His big test is whether or not he's going to let dad tie him up on the altar. Jacob, on the other hand, runs from Isaac, runs from Esau, runs from God, and God calls him back. That's Jacob, he gets called back to the promise that his forefathers had. Moses' call is...
Say, deliver his people out of
Egypt. Deliver the people out of Egypt, deliver them to the promised land. The people mess up, and so he doesn't get to do it. Joshua's call.
Yeah, this is like the Misfits Christmas.
Don't overthink it. Joshua's call is the same thing as Moses. Deliver the people into the promised land, right?
Okay, yeah.
Moses hands it off. Samuel's call was to be a prophet, but how is he called? What's the famous thing with him? He's called through...
Got nothing on this one.
Whispers, right? Okay. He's a boy in the temple under Eli, and then he hears people calling for him 3 times, and then finally Eli realizes what's going on. Samuel answers God. God gives him his call. David is called to be
Shepherd.
a little bit more than that.
The king.
The king.
Yeah.
Solomon is called not to be king. He is called to...
I was also going to say king, so that's not...
He's called to build the temple.
Hmm.
Isaiah's call is the famous one, right? Here I am, send me. Right? He's in front of the throne. Here I am, send me. Hosea's call. We talked about this during Mary Misfit. I want to see if you can remember.
I don't. The rest of this list, I'm struggling here.
Go marry a prostitute and have children with her.
That's right.
Interesting call, but it's still his call. That's not his, and we'll get into a little bit more. That his vocation is not prostitution, for those that don't know the story. Jeremiah's call was to be a prophet, but what's different about Jeremiah than Isaiah?
I'm striking out on a lot of these.
Jeremiah
is not as good as we thought it would go.
Jeremiah says, no, I don't want it.
Yeah.
Isaiah is like all for it. Jeremiah is like, get me out of here. John the Baptist is called to go out into the wilderness and
preach the gospel.
Prepare the way, preach the gospel, say repent or perish. The king is, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, all of that. The disciples are called to be...
I was going to say, go and make other disciples.
Well, eventually they're called to go make other disciples, but initially they are called to come be
fisher. Well, I was followers of Jesus. Is that
disciples?
Disciples,
yeah.
okay.
They're called to be disciples.
Be themselves. That's maybe I was.
We have examples of all of this stuff, and now this is the fun part of this: is that when we talk Bible calling and vocation, it's completely different than when we were talking about it when we talk about people, because that was all about what.
God's...
No, I'm talking worldly.
Oh.
Worldly calling, worldly vocation. We were all talking what?
Specifically about like a happiness or a job
specifically
career.
For money, lifestyle, career, ease of life, all of that kind of stuff. Out of the people that we mentioned, what you know about them from Scripture, what you can remember now that you remember who they are.
Yeah, now that I got the brief refresher.
How many of them would you describe as being happy, career-oriented, and have enough money to live off of? Just off the top of your head. There's only one that really can fit that has enough money to have a career off of.
Solomon
has money.
Yeah, is who I would put up there.
Right? David as king is fine, but there's a lot of time where David's on the run. Moses literally is in exile in the desert. There's nothing there. Abram is a very wealthy man, but not initially. Yeah. He gets his wealth coming in.
We know what happens with many of the disciples, as we talked about with the prosperity gospel. Noah,
he just, ends up naked in a tent drunk, by the end of all of it. The idea of success in vocation and calling is different from a biblical standard than what we have with a worldly standard. And that's because when we talk about calling, the words that we should be using is not actually calling or vocation. Any guesses as to what words we should be using without looking at what's next on your
I won't
list?
Cheat on the next one there. Well, since I can't use those two words, is not what I wanted to say. Was God's calling on our life, which
is different. Why? What is it that God is actually doing when He's calling us?
Well, I was just going to say it's to love God and to love other people.
That's what He's calling us to.
Yes.
That is the purpose side of things. That's what He's calling us to. But when we are called as believers, it's the same sort of idea as being set apart that we have when we talk about Christians compared to the rest of the world as well. We are set apart. We are sanctified. We're cleansed. All of these different things. And so the words that we really should be talking about when we talk about our callings, even though you're not wrong for using the word callings, we use the word callings all the time on here if you've listened.
Yeah.
Is really about the sanctifying, the setting apart, the ordaining a spiritual blessing to do this, and a consecrating, a holy, becoming holy in God's standard of holy, like we see with Isaiah.
Mm-hmm.
And so the word that we see for called or set apart, all that's in Jeremiah chapter 1, when Jeremiah gets his call, is the Hebrew word kadosh. And this is a word that is much more than just "I called you out." What we see, the calling of Jeremiah is the whole "I knew you before you were born, I knit you together in mother's womb, and I set you apart as a prophet to the nations." That carries a lot more weight than just, "I feel like I would be a good doctor, let's go do this thing, give me a scalpel and a knife."
Yeah, let's not have that happen.
Yeah, we already know the math and science skills on this show. That is really what the question you asked is really about, as far as the difference between a vocation and a calling when we are talking about a biblical standard for all of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Is that it's not just about where we show up for work Monday morning. It's much more about where God is placing us at the moment.
Yeah, it's kind of where our heart's at.
Right.
And instead of the exact location in a way, which in that, I feel like in that example of Jeremiah, it can also feel like a larger weight in the world of, all right, God put this before me, and this is the task that he's given me, which I think he all gives us specific tasks to carry out and do, given to our own abilities. And sometimes it feels like a bigger weight. It's in that quiet time. It's not just that, here's a list, Andrew, of your list from God of your to-do list in life.
Check it off.
Yeah. But it's those different callings that I think he gives all of us specifically that can sometimes feel like a added weight personally, or sometimes it's a challenge, but also that we know that he is with us throughout it.
And that is what we're going to talk about after we hear from Laird Creative Agency.
We'll be right back.
Season 2 of the Ministry Misfits podcast and our awesome theme song are brought to you by Laird Creative Agency.
In our social media world, the next connection is always one click or scroll away, and your business has to be ready when they find you.
That's why Laird Creative is always looking for ways to step your brand up. Whether you're looking to overhaul your brand one time with a new website or want to save money by outsourcing your graphic and media content, Laird Creative Agency is here to help. Laird Creative's mission is to take the difficulty out of the creative process. With Laird Creative, you'll find a dedicated team of artists ready to tackle any creative need that your business has, big or small.
If you're looking for an easier way to share the vision of your organization through thoughtful branding and creative content, find them at lairdcreativeagency.com to get started. Mention the Ministry Misfits podcast and get a free consultation call. Laird Creative, step your brand up.
We're back.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Today, Andrew and I are talking about vocation and calling, the difference between those, and also the worldly versus biblical examples that we have. So, Andrew already started me off with some stumping of questions, people from the Bible.
Now, to be fair, he's had this discussion with a couple other people today already. So I'm like the third person he's gotten to, and he's a little bit burnt out. So
that's why I had some cold brew coffee before coming.
Yes.
So that
so
helped.
You know, there is a little bit of a like not as bad as when he did this during COVID, but we can give him a little bit of slack here
That's
and
right.
there.
But before we started this episode, we did throw it out to both our Facebook groups, so shout out to that for those of you who are on there. And also, Andrew went to Reddit, a new favorite source of his.
I wouldn't say favorite source of mine.
Source of his.
It's a source of ours, yes.
To pose the question of, what I think you posed it. What is the difference between vocation and calling?
The question we asked, and we asked this on a couple of different channels here, said, how do you distinguish a vocation versus a calling from God? Is there a difference, or can they be the same thing? And so we actually got quite a few good answers, but there are 3 on Reddit specifically that we want to talk about. And we have no idea if these people are listening or not, so we're not going to try and butcher their usernames at all here.
Oh, I was waiting for that.
Yeah, I'm not doing the whole Jimmy Fallon thing here. One person said, everyone has a vocation. All Christians are called to the priesthood, but not all are called to ordination. Now, and he also mentions, like, and to be fair, I am Roman Catholic. So that's where he's coming from there. We also have one that is an Episcopalian. He says, for lay people, they are different. For pastors and ministers, they're the same. But that line gets blurred. For example, I'm a public school teacher with a sense of God's calling. And then he decided to, turn the question around. So what does it mean for you? And then the last one we're going to, if I can get it to stay up. Come on, there we go. It says, a vocation is by definition a calling. So he apparently listened to the first half of our podcast.
Yep, and got the Webster's Dictionary one in there.
It says, it comes from the same word that vocal does. And that is the part that he was wanting to focus on, was this idea of there's an actual listening aspect to it. Kind of like when we talked memory verses and audible as a
audible
way
as a way, as one of your sensory ways to learn. And as I was looking into this further, one thing I was finding out about vocation was a lot of this should be done in community or in a group.
Right.
To help you find your vocation sometimes.
Why do you think that is?
I think from other people's perspective, they can help see through the woods sometimes of what your gifts are and how God created you and what your gifts are. I think it's helpful at times where we get in our own ways or disqualify ourselves at times. And so sometimes it takes somebody else to help push and establish maybe that suitable career or job for us or path.
And that right there is where we need to start as far as the difference between this conversation for believers and this conversation for non-believers.
Mm-hmm.
Because like we heard even from here, there can be this vocational calling, and we can even call it a vocational calling in terms that we used at the end of the first segment with the kadosh of an ordination or sanctifying, all these different things that don't necessarily involve the church. Teachers, good teachers normally are called to do something with their students. It may not even be teaching right away, but the students are a key piece to it.
Yeah, and that could even be coaching, whatever
coaching,
that might look like.
All those sort of things. Doctors typically care for their patients if they're good doctors.
Mm-hmm.
Nurses typically care for the people under their care if they are good at nursing. Some of this is a personality thing, right? I mean, we know that.
Yeah, it's how we're wired a little bit, yeah.
But when we talk about this idea of a person being called as a believer, it goes a step further from personality.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where we talk the giftings and the vocalization of all of this, both in community and in a personal manner of the vocalization of this, as far as how has God gifted you? When there's a difference between, and we've kind of hinted at this a couple times. We'll get into it further at some point. There are good pastors. There are bad pastors. There are good preachers. There are bad preachers. There are good shepherds. There's the good shepherd, but that's not what we're talking about. There are good shepherds. There are bad shepherds. Sometimes all of the good things line up. Sometimes all of the bad things line up. Sometimes you have people that are great at shepherding, horrible at preaching. You have people that are great at preaching, horrible at shepherding. You have, how is it that God has gifted you plays into this idea of, is this a calling or not? And so part of the reason we're talking about this, people know your story with all of it.
Yeah.
You were in the business world.
Mm-hmm.
You are gifted within the business world.
Yeah.
But there was something missing.
Yeah, I think going back to what our gifts are a little bit, I think God's gifted me with favor first and foremost, and I think that a lot of times that's with people. And so being in sales, a lot of that is being around people and having conversations. And one of the reasons why people continue to buy from you is sometimes they like you in a way. You could be selling the same widget at the end of the day and the prices might be 5 cents higher. So what's that small margin or factor that is the tipping point? And so I think sometimes that relationship building can go a long ways, and as long with work ethic and a handful of other things. But what I felt like I was missing at the end of the day was I didn't want to look back 40 years from now. Let's say that's when I retire or whatever, 30, 40 years from now. And for somebody to say, wow, he was a great employee. Like, I don't want to hear that in my life. Obviously, I would love that to be partially an element of that.
That's not a bad thing.
It is not a bad thing, but I don't want my life defined by the career I did. I would rather see my life be remembered by the impact that I made on other people's lives and those conversations and places that I was with them. And so that's why I wanted to step into more of a community role. And I will say, honestly, but more so recently, I feel like I was trying to step into places that I thought would maybe bring that purpose out, instead of looking at God's true calling on my life, which, as I mentioned, is obviously love God and love other people. And that can be fleshed out in a million different ways as we talk about careers. That can be done anywhere. And so I think for me, I was chasing those different areas instead of unraveling everything to see where God truly calls us to be, and when I overcomplicated it.
And that is where we need to start looking at, how do I know the difference between when God is put something on me as a calling, or when I feel like I am being pulled somewhere vocationally. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're talking worldly. The reason we are keeping calling within the biblical context is that even within the worldly context, that Norse idea is it's a loud summon. That's more than just, I feel like I'm going to be good at this.
Yeah.
And especially those of you that know anything about Viking mythology or the Viking way of life. Things that are done intentionally and with purpose. Because that's part of it's a very much a community-based mythology and a community-based way of life. So when we talk about that in terms of a biblical church setting, that is much more along the lines of what we're talking about than vocation. Even though, and we'll get into this maybe a little bit in the third half as far as the idea of you have bivocational ministers. You have vocational ministers. That's one of the things that the writer that was the Roman Catholic was talking about. That's different than when we're talking about what is the difference between my vocation and my kadosh calling from God as a believer.
Yeah.
And part of what we need to look at with this kadosh calling of a believer is that if God is the one doing the calling, there's a couple of things that come with it. If God is the one doing the calling, we are going to be gifted in that area. Because, that's what we see in 1 Corinthians 12. That's what we see in Romans 12. There are many gifts. The Spirit gives as He chooses, but He gives it to people with the purpose of building up the body, the community. And this is part of why it's helpful to have a community to talk this stuff through with. When you started going through your process of what do I do, was right in the middle of when all communities... were going away.
And yeah.
Except for one.
Well, there was a couple, because actually before, I don't know if it was during beginning of COVID or right before it happened, I was praying for more godly men to be in community with. So one, I found the Bible study of the Brew Pastors, which we had Joe
yep.
that came on earlier. So that was one connected group, which a lot of my processing came through some of those. But then also our personal huddle, where you and I got to know each other more. And
now you're here.
And now I'm here.
And now you're here sweating through all my questioning on air.
That's right.
You had two different communities, but both of them were ones that were designed specifically to allow for more of an intimate talk.
Yeah.
And an intimate talk that allows us to be able to actually view what God is doing in each other's lives.
Yeah.
And so it was very clear as we were going through all of this that you had a heart for figuring this out.
Mm-hmm.
And not just because you wanted to figure this out for yourself, but because you knew that figuring out this for yourself meant that you were going to be able to help other people figure this out.
Yeah.
That made it a very easy transition to come in here.
Mm-hmm.
Because God is gifting you in different areas to be able to fill this. Does that mean that you are gifted in all those areas right off the bat?
Not necessarily, yeah.
But if God is the one that has called you into a specific area, God is going to provide you with the resources and tools necessary. And sometimes those resources and tool is that community. We have a very good community that we are a part of,
mm-hmm.
where there are a lot of different pieces within our group to be able to talk through this stuff. The Brew Pastors is set up in the same way. You've got people of all different areas, but all united in the same manner of Jesus as Lord.
Yeah, that's why I think the funny part of that group is a lot of people that come in new, they're like, oh, what church do you guys go to? And I'm like, we're from all over, which is great because, and some people are pastors, and it's like, hey, we don't care where you're from. We're just all united in Christ, which is the bigger thing.
And that's where the giftings come in, as far as why it says that, the Spirit gives as he chooses, but what he chooses is for the edifying of the body.
So let's also talk about the testing of the spirits. So that way we can tell what maybe is from God or not from God.
So there was one person we didn't have on our list up above, and that's Gideon.
I was gonna say, don't have me guess that one, because that
there's a lot of people.
We'll be here all day.
Right, there's a lot of people we left off, but specifically Gideon is one that I left off there. Because let's see. What's the story of Gideon?
All I can think of is the band, and I hope you know that one.
The VeggieTales version of it, or
no,
Gideon,
the Christian
band
metal
Gideon.
Band.
Okay.
Yes, yeah.
Well, the VeggieTales version of the story of Gideon involves a big band. That's why I thought you were going there. Now, Gideon is part of Israel. He's out hiding, threshing wheat for his family because, again, they've been invaded by the Canaanites because they messed up. This is in the period of the Judges. An angel shows up, tells Gideon, you're going to lead the rebellion against the Canaanites. And Gideon doesn't necessarily doubt it, but he wants confirmation that what he's being called to is God calling him and not just him wanting to see the Canaanites run out.
Yeah.
And so he tests them by putting a dry piece of fur on the ground, saying if it's wet in the morning and the driest ground, I'll know God is doing it. Wakes up, it's wet, the ground's dry. He's like, well, that could be dew. So we're going to do this one more time. If it's dry and the ground around it is wet, then I'll know. And sure enough, he wakes up, it's dry, the ground is wet. And so he he goes off and they defeat everybody through literally just scaring the daylights out of them.
Yeah.
We are not supposed to do that, right?
Not in that sense.
Right.
No.
It's not wise to test God.
Correct. That's why I was like, there's a fine line of testing the spirits of like, am I supposed to do this, and maybe taking small steps forward to see, all right, is that door opening or closing, versus testing God.
And this is where Jeremiah comes back in. The Jeremiah and I get along pretty
I know,
well.
he's your favorite.
Yes. And part of the reason we get along is because when God comes to him, Jeremiah is like, there's no way. Look at who I am. God doesn't get mad. God just tells him to toughen up and deal with it. But part of what we see with that is that throughout Jeremiah's ministry, Vocation, he's dealing with that kind of attitude among the people. Testing God is not the same thing as discerning of the spirits.
Yes.
Jeremiah was not testing God. He was also not discerning of the spirits. He was asking the question of, why would I be worthy of this? And normally what we see from people in today's world that are feeling like they're being called somewhere is much more of a Jeremiah, is this a calling, than what we see with Gideon of, is this really God or not?
Yeah.
Because I think we need to look more at the heart issue behind this, is that it's much more of a fear of failure than it is I don't want to go off and do something that God hasn't called me to.
Yeah, and I think that was a part in the back of my mind too, while I was in between jobs, of almost that fear of, okay, I stepped down on a leap of faith into nothing. And so it almost felt like that next career had to be the one and be where I was going to be at forever. And just kind of people putting me at peace of like, no, everything is kind of for a season, for its time, and God's got its purpose of where everything is at. And so trying to let go of that weight that I felt of whatever's next has to be the best perfect thing, which is going to be the trajectory for the rest of my life. It's like, no, it doesn't have to be that.
And this again is where we can look at the role of the Spirit in all of this. God does not make mistakes.
No.
And so if God is placing you somewhere with a specific purpose in mind, he has gifted you to do it. We don't have to put so much pressure on ourselves. This is the story of Esther. She's in the palace. She's in the exact position God needs. She doesn't, she's not sure if she should do it or not. She doesn't know if this is going to get her killed or not. But Mordecai's message to her is, don't think of yourself so highly that you are the one that's going to do this. If you say no, God will raise up somebody else.
Yeah.
But you're not going to make it out if you say no. Because you are here for such a time as this. Now, with that being said, it doesn't mean that if you say no, God's going to strike you down. We'll get to that in a second. But the idea that if God is calling me to something, that means I have to step up right now and do it, is not the attitude that is required.
Yeah. It needs to be more of that humility standpoint, again, of coming from your heart of where you're at. It's not, okay, he gave me this, so here I'm going to power through and watch out, everybody. I've got this new calling. And so, like you said, no matter what I do, I can't be wrong because God called me to this.
And that's the Daniel mindset. When Daniel goes before the king and the king says, so you know what my dream is, Daniel straight up says, I have no idea what your dream is, but God does, and he's allowing me to tell you what it is. It's not about him. It's about the God that sent him. This is the message that we see in 1 Corinthians 1 that we talked about back, I don't remember when, one of these episodes we talked about in 1 Corinthians 1, where Paul tells the Corinthians, why are you guys tribalizing around the pastors? Did Paul die for you?
Mm.
Were you baptized in Apollos' name? Is Jesus divided? Because it's not about the person that's in the position. It's about the kingdom that has commissioned the person that is there on mission.
Yeah.
Now, with that being said, we do need to transition into this second part of this. What happens when I say no?
Is that a question for me of what
Well,
happened?
yeah, we'll start with you. What happens when we say no to God? Are we going to be struck down? Are we going to be passed over? Have we lost our salvation? Does it mean we have no faith and so we're really just atheists pretending? What happens when we tell God no?
Well, first off, we're not going to get immediately struck down. That's not going to happen to us. But I think, we can't be God to know what's fully going to happen. But I think it depends on what his plan is. Like, if we continue to say no, like as we see in other people in the Bible that have initially said no, but even though they try to mess everything up, even with Jonah as an example, like God's will still prevails, and that plan may then get twisted from what we think will happen, but God's overall goal or vision will still be carried out. And so obviously there's still love there that God has for us. So I think it'll be that's tough to think of, like what happens when we say no, because I guess I always want to say like it's going to prevail in the end, but I guess there is that tugging of our heart. If you just become cold, I don't know what would.
And this is where the fun part comes in, is that there's so many different examples in Scripture that give us a different kind of understanding. We really don't know. But we do know at the same time. Mordecai's answer, Mordecai to Esther, is God is going to raise up somebody regardless of what you do.
Mm-hmm.
But you are going to perish because you were put here with the responsibility to do this and you are saying no. You have Jonah who says no, and he runs. God literally just stops him, throws him up on where he needs to be. But then it ends with Jonah in just throwing a big hissy fit on a mountain.
Yeah.
You have, the example of Judas, who, by all accounts, has said no to his calling of being a disciple. John talks about the fact that Satan entered him. But at the same time, Judas was supposed to do what he did.
Yeah, he was almost given a calling.
He was, it was prophesied that this would happen.
Mm-hmm. Somebody had to do it.
So you've got that side of it, and much more with there you have what we really see is a mental breakdown on the part of Judas. There was no chance for restoration for Judas because he took matters into his own hand. Peter says no to his calling and denies Jesus 3 times and instead is restored.
Mm-hmm.
Because he didn't break down to the point of destruction. There are so many different areas of all of this stuff that we really don't know, but there are a couple things that we do know. One is that God does not need us to accomplish anything.
Mm-hmm.
This is what we see in the book in Daniel chapter 5 Daniel chapter 4. Let's start with the right chapter. Daniel chapter 4 of, man is dust. God accounts him as dust. And no one can ask him, what have you done?
Yeah.
He does not need us. At the same time, God uses us. Esther, David, Noah, Abram, the whole list that we gave at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
We also see another example of the word no being used in what we see as a result. That just because God does not need us and God is in control does not mean that there are not consequences to our saying no. Why is it that Haman hates the Jews?
Because of the firstborn? No, I'm thinking of, I don't know.
So we go back to the book of Samuel. Saul is king. And Saul is commanded to go, and when he routs this army, he's supposed to not leave anything alive. Man, woman, child, cattle, anything. It is supposed to be a complete devastation. Obviously, if this is about somebody saying no to their calling, what do you think happens?
It's not going to be good for them.
Saul says no.
Yeah.
And leaves the king alive as a slave and the king's family. It's believed that the woman, the wife, escapes. She's pregnant with the king's child. When we go into, and that king's name was Agag. When we get into the book of Esther, and when Haman is introduced, he's not just Haman, the king's right-hand man. It is Haman, the Agagite. He hates the Jews because the Jews wiped out his family line. So the entire reason we have Haman's attempt to completely destroy the Jewish people is a direct result of Saul saying no to the calling that God has given him. We look at why the people of Israel are taken into Babylon. We talked about this, I think it was with Dr. Barr. We kind of shared this story a little bit with King Hezekiah. King Hezekiah goes and shows off all the stuff that he's not supposed to show to the Babylonians. And when Isaiah comes and confronts him, rather than repenting, he says, well, at least there's peace in my time. And as a result, we see what happens. But at the same time, we also know that Judah specifically had to go into exile. That's why Nebuchadnezzar is given the call. That's why Cyrus is given the call. There are consequences to the actions of people that say no. But even those consequences do not thwart the plan of God because, again, God does not need
God
us.
uses it for good, or at least part of his plan.
And now the one other place that we need to look at before we take one more break here is what happens when we say yes. What happens when we say yes?
God works through us to carry out whatever, his will still be carried out, but I think he then uses us to share his glory and who he is. I think a lot of times
when you say share his glory, we'll clarify this. We're saying we are sharing his glory as far as showing it, giving it out, not sharing it as in we are now sharing the glory with God.
Correct. Yes. You know
well,
what I meant.
Yes. That's why I was like, we're going to clarify that before we get some letters. Keep going now.
No, I lost my train of thought, but yeah, I think we're just that representation of a small little bit of who God or Jesus is. And a lot of those times, either whether that's like the voice or to be or to do something at times, God uses us to be that vocal piece, kind of like we talked about at the beginning.
Right.
Through that calling.
You're correct, but you didn't answer the question. What happens to us? Because if we're talking about when we say no, this is what happens. we deal with the consequences. There's, we can feel the consequences. There's something within us that knows we have said no.
Mm-hmm.
What happens when we say yes?
Personally, I think it would be peace. I think
Okay.
there's peace in what you're doing is the calling of God versus, just feeling that, again, that personal weight of I did do it. So you're going to be, I feel like, in fear.
And that's the part that we want to get to, is this idea of the personal weight. Because unfortunately what happens sometimes when we say yes to the calling, and especially when it's a calling to vocational ministry, that weight that we feel is no longer a weight of guilt. Oh, I didn't do this. Now it's a weight of, oh, God's called me to represent him. And so that means I have to look and act the part at all times.
Mm-hmm.
That is not what God is calling anyone to do.
Yeah.
God does not call people to be anybody other than who God has created them to be.
Yeah.
That's why we started this with the Misfits. Just because you have been called to fill a pulpit does not mean that you have to go get rid of your style of music, your style of clothing, the way you do your hair, whether you wear contacts or glasses, the translation of scripture that you use. God has called you into this role, not called that role onto you.
Yeah. And now God might call those things to change, and that you don't go in again stubborn-headed of
Right.
my way or the highway.
But even with that, if God is the one that is calling you, and it's something where something has to change or something has to develop, we know where that's coming from.
Mm-hmm.
That's the role of the Spirit. The Spirit doing that within you is a sign of God working on you. And if that's the case, we have nothing to do with it. And so that weight, that chip on our shoulder, does not need to be there and should not be there, because when it is there, it produces something other than the fruit of the Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, all you have to do to see what that fruit looks like in a modern context is go on Twitter for a while.
Your favorite place to be.
Right. Some of these statements that are being made that are you see all over the internet, all of these things that we see that are coming out of places like Hillsong, Elevation, places like the Grace Chapel in California, all of the different guys that started out as actual evangelists and now are on TBN trying to spit at COVID, is that chip on their shoulder they've discovered is too heavy to carry on their own, but they don't know what to do with it otherwise.
Mm.
And so if they have to feel the chip, so does everybody else. And that's not what God has called us to do.
No. And I think that goes back to what we were saying earlier about the community aspect where,
right.
Sure, there is that individual calling, but there's also the calling for us to be in community.
And that's what we talked about everybody. With Dr. Linville.
Yeah.
Back at whenever month that was, because I have no idea. I don't know what episode this is or what day we're releasing it, so I don't know how many months ago it was. But this idea of, the call to the calling, the being summoned, the loud summon of wanting to be a part of the body. Because when we're in the body, we're with like-minded people that are also dealing with the same feeling of I'm carrying this weight that I don't know how to carry.
Yeah.
Whether that's because they are supposed to be doing stuff Sunday morning or whether it's because they are doing heavy stuff Monday through Friday. Well, Saturday, because I guess there's 2 days there, isn't there? Monday through Saturday.
That's just
we are just
we're
horrible with numbers.
Okay.
Like, we can't even get the days of the week right anymore, man. Regardless of where that chip is, we feel it.
Yeah.
And so that's where we're going to close out with after we hear from our affiliate sponsor, as far as what we are actually supposed to do with the weight of the calling.
We'll be right back.
Today's a great day to start your own podcast. Whether you're looking for a new marketing channel, have a message you want to share with the world, or just think it would be fun to have your own talk show, podcasting is an easy, inexpensive, and fun way to expand your online reach.
Buzzsprout is hands down the easiest and best way to launch, promote, and track your podcast. Your show can be online listened on all major platforms within minutes of finishing your first recording. We just switched to Buzzsprout for Season 2 and have immediately noticed the difference.
With Buzzsprout, you get a great-looking podcast website, audio players that you can drop into your websites, detailed analytics to see how people are listening, tools to promote your episodes, and more. Podcasting isn't hard when you have the right partners, and Buzzsprout and the Misfits want to help you get started.
Contact us for a free consultation call, and then visit our affiliate link to get started with Buzzsprout. Using this link not only helps support the Misfits, but it also gets you a $20 Amazon gift card. The teams at Buzzsprout and Ministry Misfits are passionate about helping you succeed. Join over 100,000 podcasters already using Buzzsprout to get their message out to the world. To find out more, go to www.ministrymisfits.com/affiliates.
We're back.
All right, everybody, welcome back. We are about to close out, but we still have a little bit we need to talk about this idea of the difference between a vocation and a calling and what that actually means when we talk about that in terms of a believer.
Yeah, because we just went through kind of through a believer too of what does that mean when I say no to God's calling.
And that you are not going to be struck down.
Correct.
Even though sometimes you may feel like you would rather have that.
Yeah. But now we're going to break it down into what happens when you say yes. Well, before we get there, we talked about the burden and weight that could be carried, both of saying yes and saying no. But we're going to specifically get into the weight of saying yes to that God's calling on your life. So you've shared a little bit before, and this gets a little bit into why Jeremiah is one of your favorites. But talk again about your calling and I guess part of that weight that you felt or are currently feeling.
So my calling started at 13 and was a series of no's until 18. And then as soon as I said yes, the weight side of it was not the weight that we typically associate with all of this. Because normally what, like we're talking about is the idea of, the safe, and this is a fully true statement, the safest place to be is within the will of God.
Mm-hmm.
But that's also the most dangerous place to be.
Yeah, it's where the devil comes to.
Well, not even just where the devil comes, but if we're talking about the fact that we are within the will of God and we know what God's plans are for his creation, there's a lot that goes into that, which we don't have time to do today. But that is the reality, is that the safest place to be is in the will, but that's also the most dangerous.
Yeah.
We've talked before on here about what it means to be in a deconstruction phase. We've talked about this. We've talked about even what we're talking about now as far as walking through what it means to be called. How do we know we're really called into something when if we're not, and all these other things. We talked about that chip on the shoulder. We've talked about the chip being knocked off. We've covered a lot of this stuff. When I said yes and go into Bible college, the chip on my shoulder was not the type of chip that we were talking about in the second section.
Mm-hmm.
Because that the weight that I had on me was a weight of depression, not a weight of, oh, well, this is what God's called me to do, yippee-ki-yay, ki-yay. It was much more of, okay, this is what God has been telling me I was going to do for a while now. And I've been saying no. And now I'm here saying yes. And what I'm seeing and facing is not what we always hear about people seeing or facing when they finally say yes to God.
Mm-hmm.
And not in the Jonah sense of where I feel horrible because people are being saved.
Yeah.
That's a completely different type of thing than we're talking about. What I'm referring to is the idea of I finally say yes to God, and then I go somewhere where people are telling me that the God that I have been worshiping, that has been calling me, is not the same God that they read about in the Bible.
Yeah, and you're referring to groups of believers.
And I'm referring to not just groups of believers, I'm referring to groups of believers and believers that have authority over training of other believers. And in addition to that, I also was walking through this and developing relationships with people that I also are seeing them having said yes for, we have already talked about this is Greg's 50th year in ministry. So this would have been like his 35th year in ministry, which is still a long time.
Yes.
No, not 35th. This would have been 38, I guess. Math.
Yeah, I was like, why were you trying to count
Math,
this?
Yeah. And to see the way that he was being treated because of his calling.
Mm-hmm.
And then in addition to that, then the way that I was being treated for finally saying yes to my calling was not something that anyone had prepared me for. But the way, and then, you go into my ministry career over the past however many years it's been.
Mm-hmm.
And it has been a lot of these sort of things of where we know that we were in this place for such a time as this. But the results that we are seeing is not what everybody had told us. The results are when you say yes to the call of God.
Yeah, they expect it to almost be easy at times, and that.
Well, not even easy. They expect to see success.
Yeah, the results.
They expect to see success, both ministry and finances and family and everything else. You don't expect to hear about somebody who is serving in ministry and serving as a missionary of sorts, through the way that CSRM is set up, in the American model of missionary, as far as what we're talking about there. We'll talk missiology another time. You don't expect to hear from them that just randomly they lose a child.
Yeah.
And not only do they randomly lose a child, but then they're fired from their job after randomly losing their child for stuff that happened while they were on bereavement. From a Christian organization.
Yeah.
You don't expect to hear, you don't expect to hear things going down like the way they have gone down. And so the response from some people is, well, maybe you were not actually called.
Yeah.
Because if you were called, you would be experiencing other things. This is actually, we haven't talked about on here. Part of the reason why we are not saying go support through CSRM now is that because of a lack of financial support coming in from places that had promised support in this year to me, I no longer can financially afford to serve in the role I was serving in within CSRM. I am still with CSRM, but in a different role.
Yeah.
But people do not know, especially within our American context of what we're talking about here. Because, like we said at the beginning, culturally, everything is about that career. Everything is about where the money is coming from. A ministry that does not model that culture does not make sense in our brains.
Yeah, it's very true. And I also think of potentially in your situation of Job a little bit of with his three friends there of, oh, you must have done something wrong. And Job kind of being like, well, then tell me what I did wrong.
Right.
One, being kind of mad at them for bringing this up, but then two, okay, then truly tell me what sin I committed. What did I do wrong?
And this is where, we had that, we've had those talks. We've had those talks with people after some of these different situations. But the unfortunate side of this also, and we're not trying to discourage anybody from pursuing ministry from this conversation, by the way. We'll get to that in a minute.
Just be a misfit of ministry.
That's right. Was the fact that, the things that we warned about, that we were seeing and that we were wanting to make changes and that we were there to make those changes. The things that we were warning about, we get reports back after we've been gone that exactly what we warned about has happened. Which should be an encouraging thing because, oh, good, you've been listening to God. And God is commending you and saying, see, you were right all along. But that's not what happens.
Yeah, that's what I was about to ask is how do you, looking back. And
just one time I would love to get a phone call saying you were completely off your rocker. Look at how God is blessing us now. That would be awesome.
Yeah.
But instead, we get reports about people being shot. We get reports back of entire families being excommunicated from their communities. We are hearing reports of, one thing or another. There's no way to feel okay about that.
No.
And this is where, we haven't touched on it just yet, but we touch on it all the time. Is that the other side of a calling from God is this holy discontent.
Mm-hmm.
Of where it doesn't matter if I said, okay, I give up on this or not. I cannot physically give up on this, or I physically am not going to be okay.
Yeah.
Because it's, when God is, using the Norse idea of a loud summon, if God is summoning you, there's a reason behind it. If the Spirit is calling you, there's a reason behind it, and he is gifting you in certain areas. And he is using the person that you are, not the person that everybody expects you to be, but the person that you are. It's much more than just showing up on Sunday morning, shaking a few hands and saying, okay, here we are, God's using us, yay.
Yeah.
We've talked about, I have had these conversations. I don't know if you have, with some of our internationals that we have within our network. And the thing that we have lost within our missiology here in the U.S. Missiology, we've talked about all these different ologies before. Ecclesiology was the church, soteriology, salvation. Missiology is the theology of mission, going out, the Great Commission, all that. We like to sing the song of I'm in the Lord's army. And everybody, the whole I'm going to shoot the infantry, all that stuff.
It's a great song.
We talk about putting on the full armor of God and carrying the big banner out and no, we're going to fight the devil and all this stuff. The majority of ministry is much more of a special ops type warfare than it is the big flashy battle that gets broadcasted to everybody. And that's not something that we talk about enough or are prepared for.
Yeah, I think probably our pride gets in the way of that too.
And
which
that's
is obviously
the big piece of it.
The sin of our human nature of we want that flashy battle because then it comes back to,
look at
me. I listened to God's calling. 2, I fulfilled it out. And 3, then, okay, where's the goods?
Right.
What you talked about.
Now bring the, I get all the rewards in heaven because of this.
Yeah.
And that's not even why we share our story.
Mm-mm.
If we wanted to see earthly rewards here, all I would have to do is call out a few people's names with these stories.
Yeah.
That's not why we are doing this. Because it doesn't matter what happens with those situations anymore. What matters is the fact that there are going to be other people that face this sort of thing within ministry and need to know that just because you do not fit the model and mold that everybody says you are supposed to does not mean that you were not called or following your calling. Greg brings up all the time John Mark out of Scripture. John Mark is Barnabas's cousin or nephew, one of the two. Those are kind of interchangeable within the way that we read all that. But, Barnabas wants him along. Paul says, okay. And the first time that he's along, Mark is like, this is not for me. I'm going home. And Paul holds that against him when it's time to go again. And that causes Paul and Barnabas to split. Barnabas takes Mark. Paul takes Silas. And that's where we get all the other stories of Paul and Silas. But what we find out later through Paul's writings is that at I can't remember where it's at, but in one of the epistles, he says, bring Mark to me because I have great need for him. And Mark eventually ends up with Peter and hears the stories and writes the gospel from Peter's account. And it is spread throughout the empire. But if he had stayed trying to be his cousin, uncle, whoever he is, rather than being Mark, the author, we don't have the majority of the Gospels.
Yeah.
And we don't know exactly what Paul is summoning Mark for. But we also may not even have it's very likely that Mark may have been the scribe as Paul is getting old. He's like, I can't do this anymore. I need somebody I know can write this down and do it well.
Yeah.
You look at a guy like Luke. Luke is a doctor. And he never stops being a doctor. The whole reason he stays with Paul is because Paul needs a doctor. We know that Paul has a digestive condition. He talks about it regularly that he has a digestive condition and needs a doctor with him at all times. But because of that, we have the full record of what Paul does and how God uses somebody that he has called out of darkness into light.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about, is this a vocation? Is this a calling? Is God calling me? Is this just a desire? It doesn't necessarily mean that the three things are even separate. It means that we need to just be ready and willing to listen to what God is calling us to do.
Yeah, I remember it was one of Corey's sermons and also Maquita from Tikva. Shout out to Tikva again. Of
Yes, go get your T-shirts.
Of saying, being available and just that emptying of yourself to be available to what God has for his kingdom and for this world, and to just be a part in it and not to be the one doing, but just to be available.
Be a part, not be it.
Yes. And I think that's, again, a key posture to be in.
So we are out of time. We want to hear from you as far as, one, again, what do you think of the setup? We think we got the glare off my giant head fixed this time. So if it's still there, we'll see.
I'm still seeing it a little bit. We'll see.
Yeah, we're still experimenting with that. So don't judge the new setup based off the glare coming off of my face. But we still want to hear from you about that. We also want to hear your thoughts on all of this. What has being called by God meant for you? What does it look like? How do you know that it's God? All of that stuff that we've talked about today.
Also,
I'm trying to remember what else we got.
Well, don't forget to check out our new website.
Oh, yeah, the website. That's what it was.
www.ministrymisfits.com, where you can check out some of our previous podcasts and anybody that we brought on as special guests, some of their books, different things, and then also how to support us.
That's right. So the main way now is through Patreon, if I could say it right.
To be a patron through Patreon.
To be a patron through Patreon. You can go there. That's where you can support us monthly. There's a couple of different options there with some different benefits. And we've even got some exciting stuff coming up with new guests that are already lining up to come in and share with you all. Beth Allison Barr is coming back later this summer once school is done. We've got some guys like Joash Thomas out of the International Justice Mission in Canada, Joshua Smith, who wrote a book on robots, which that's going to be a fun one.
Yeah, so some interesting stuff, and hopefully they'll each be providing some special content against some of those top-level Patreon supporters that continue the mission here at Ministry Misfits. You can also buy any of our shirts or some of the other swag available.
That's right. The merch, the Misfit merch, I think is what we were calling it.
I like that better.
Yeah, the Misfit merch.
Misfit merch and Tikva tea. We got to go with that alliteration.
The Tikva tea, and again, the Tikva tea, all profits from that, 70% of it goes back to the work that they are doing here in Canton. So give us a like, give us a comment, let us know what's going on with you. Let us know if there's anything you want us to talk about. If you want to be a guest, there's a spot for you to fill out that form on the website as well under Contact Us. So a lot of different things to start communicating with us, because we'd love to actually talk with you instead of just seeing your name pop up every once in a while on Facebook.
Yeah, a brand new community, and who knows, we might even take this live sometime. And
that's right. We are preparing for that, and we even have 1 or 2 special guests that are waiting for us to be able to go live, because we've got some fun things planned to do with them live where they can't say it didn't happen.
Yeah, and you can see how we act live without any of the cuts that Andrew puts in there, which isn't
really
as much anymore.
It's really about the same as it's always been. There's really no way to hide the insanity that goes on in here.
That's
so
right.
We will be back next week. I don't remember what we've got planned. I don't know if I don't remember. The days are all it's this is not good, man.
Together.
We're like what, 2 weeks in, 3-4 weeks in,
so
and
this is week 4. So
right,
we're a month
of season 2.
Yes.
And we already don't remember what we have planned or going on. We just know that it's going to be worth tuning into. So
that's right.
We will see you next week.
The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Ministry Misfit Media in association with Overwhelming Victory. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. The Ministry Misfits theme song is written and produced by J.D. Laird and Laird Creative Agency. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also visit our website at www.ministrymisfits.com or through bio.link/ministrymisfits. If you would like to support Ministry Misfits, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/ministrymisfits.